Hello everyone, my name is Maria Marcano Olivier and I am the Level 4 Year Tutor for Combined Psychology students. Today we're going to be doing a session on embedding literature into writing. In this session, we will be discussing identifiers of academic literature so that you're aware of which sources you're able to choose. And then we will discuss how to go about finding these sources of information before identifying where it might be appropriate to reference non-peer reviewed sources, because whilst we expect students to reference peer-reviewed sources the vast majority of the time, there are circumstances in which referencing non-peer reviewed sources can be appropriate. And then finally, we will go through a walkthrough task of pin the X on the missing citation. Now in this task, I will walk you through a paragraph and together we will identify where in that paragraph you would need to cite your sources of information. The most common forms of academic source are books written by subject experts, journal articles written by researchers or academic commentators, and published reports. These can be published by the government, by charities, by research organisations, but these generally are unbiased pieces of information. Sources such as newspaper articles, magazine articles, opinion pieces, and websites are not commonly academic, although there are some exceptions. Many journal articles and reports can be found online, for example. If you find a newspaper article or a magazine article that seems to present a wealth of interesting information, it's best to identify the sources that the author of that piece has used to write their own piece and examine those for reliability before using those sources in your own work rather than simply citing the newspaper or magazine article. As some magazine articles and newspaper articles can be written in a way that makes them seem like an academic source, a great way to identify whether or not they are academic sources is to apply the criteria listed below. So, these include identifying what the qualifications of the author are. Academic authors are likely to come from a university or institute, and academic writing is often published by a university press. If, once you've identified the author, you have a search on the internet for their academic qualifications, and you can see that actually they do not have professional qualifications in the area of expertise that you would expect them to have. This doesn't necessarily mean that what they're saying isn't true, but it does mean that you should look for a source where the authors have got formal expertise in the area that they are discussing. The second thing to look for is, are the sources listed? So the person who's written this report or this academic source will have gathered their information from other academic sources, or that's what we would hope. And in academia, you must publish a reference list or bibliography to show where you got your information from. In non-academic sources, such as newspapers or magazine articles, often their reference lists are missing entirely. For example, reading an article in The Guardian might seem like an academic source, but without a reference list, we can't be sure that their information is unbiased. Discussion of bias brings us on to discussing peer review. So, has the writing been peer reviewed? This means that rather than simply submitting a piece to an online publication or a magazine, you submit your piece of writing to the source editors. They read this piece and decide whether or not it fits within the remit of their source, and they then send this to two other experts in the field to read your work and see whether or not they believe that it is sufficiently academic to be published. This is how we know that pieces in academic journals can be trusted, because they have gone through a peer-reviewed process to identify whether or not that piece can be trusted and if it should be considered to be a non-biased source in the academic community. Peer-reviewed journals will therefore have an editorial board or a committee listed, or provide instructions to authors that describe their standard peer review process. Sometimes their peer review process could be relatively short, going to an editor and then one peer reviewer. Other times there may be different levels of peer review, but there will definitely be a peer-reviewed process in academic literature. One thing that the peer reviewers will be looking for is whether or not the writing is objective. So even if an author is discussing something that is generally agreed to be true, such as whether or not there is a bias in a racial bias in the legal system, we would still expect that author to consider both sides of the argument before landing on the conclusion that is most supported by evidence. So, a piece that is titled Donald Trump and his blatant racism was probably going to be a non-academic piece of writing. However, a piece of writing entitled An Exploration of Donald Trump's Discussions on Race, Is Donald Trump Racist? That might be considered to be an academic source, or that one's certainly more likely to be an academic source, because it will consider both sides of the coin before landing on the conclusion that is most supported by the evidence. So considering both sides of the argument is the most scientific way of discussing something, even if that thing that's being discussed is generally considered to be fact. The next thing to consider is who is the target audience. So consider the style of the writing. Is it written with an academic voice for professionals, or is it quite journalistic and sensationalist to stir up emotions in the reader? Consider the presence of advertising. Advertising is less likely in academic sources. And also consider where you found the source. Was the source in a magazine, generally read by the public, or is the source in an academic book or an academic journal or a report published online by the government? Ultimately, you must consider the purpose of the source. Academic writing aims to inform experts in a subject area. It does not aim to sell something or present one person's opinion independent of evidence or logic. So now that we've discussed what constitutes as academic literature, let's discuss finding your sources. We start by identifying search paths. So this is identifying the different ways that we can find our information. And there are many ways that you can do this. You can search databases. You can search citations of papers that you have found helpful so far and comb through their references to find relevant articles that they considered helpful that you might also consider to be helpful. You can hand search, reviewing tables of content in key relevant journals. So, for example, if you're looking into systematic racism, you might want to look at journals considering racial bias in the criminal justice system, or you might want to look at social psychology journals and intergroup behaviour. Another search path includes expert polling. Now this is asking lecturers who are experts in the subject area that you're writing in where they might suggest you search for this information. The staff at the library might also be helpful with this. You would also consider popular polling. So reviewing popular sources such as magazines and newspapers and trying to identify where they have cited relevant sources. So if you're looking at writing an essay on sex and relationships, you might look at magazines that discuss sex and relationships, such as popular women's magazine Cosmopolitan. If you have a look at their writing, their articles, and see who they have cited for their information, it might be worth your time to have a look at those sources as well. Finally, we have random firing. Now this is a random trial of search terms in a search engine to determine whether any additional hits are returned. So if you've gone through databases, citation searching, etc., and you just want to make sure that you've not missed anything, you can randomly search keywords and phrases in search engines and see if anything else comes up. Next, you want to limit your search parameters. This involves deciding what type of source you want to consider. So options include the type of paper. Do you want to look at empirical research papers, so studies? Do you want to consider essays, such as literature reviews, or opinion pieces, where an academic expresses their opinion on a subject based on their own expert opinion and supported by evidence? Be clear on the rationale for your selection if you have, for example, decided to choose to only include essays to inform your work. Now, this rationale might be that you are looking at a completely new phenomena and therefore there is no other research in the area, and so you're simply considering essays or opinion papers that have touched on the subject. Next, consider the publication outlet. Are you only going to consider peer-reviewed journals? Are you also going to consider magazine literature or grey literature? So this is non-peer-reviewed sources, such as unpublished material like conference papers and dissertations. And finally, consider the dates of your publications. For example, if you're looking at the influence of social media on disordered eating behaviour, you might want to consider only quite recent publications, as social media has changed a lot over the last few years, and so studies discussing the use of social media and disordered eating behaviour published in 2010 is no longer likely to be particularly relevant. The next stage is to develop your search strategies. Options to do this include posing a short general research question and then exploring topics that are related to that general topic, or using connectors or parentheses to extend or limit a search so that you are only reading or that your search engine is only generating information that is relevant to your research question. Just before we go through a worked example, let's discuss if we can ever use non-peer-reviewed sources in our writing, particularly non-academic sources. So there are a few circumstances where you might include non-academic sources within your writing. However, these must be used with caution. One way that you might use non-peer-reviewed sources is if you're drawing the attention of your reader to a way that a phenomenon was discussed in the press. For example, on the right-hand side of the screen, we see the response of the Daily Mail to an artist called Grayson Perry. We discussed this artist at length in the module Popular Images and Psychological Understanding, where we're discussing the public reception of some artists. Now, Grayson Perry has been considered by the media to be a very outlandish and exciting character, but the Daily Mail has often posted rather insulting and toxic masculine responses to Grayson Perry's appearance or his choice of appearance and art. And so it would be appropriate to cite the Daily Mail in essays discussing Grayson Perry if you're discussing the way that Grayson Perry has been treated by the media. Further, you might also use non-academic sources if you're discussing public opinion or critical reception. So again, if you're discussing art, such as a literal piece of art or perhaps a film, you might want to discuss how that film has been received by the public or by critics. So in which case, citing an article from The Guardian reviewing the film might be a good way to show how the public and critics have responded to this artistic piece. For the last part of this session, I will walk you through a task called Pin the X on the missing citation. Now, there are many reasons why we would embed academic literature into writing, and they fall beneath these categories. The first is defining a phenomena in operational terms. So, if you were discussing schizophrenia as part of your essay, in the introduction to your essay, you would define schizophrenia using academic sources such as the DSM-5. You would also use academic literature to support a generalized statement. For example, when discussing schizophrenia, you might discuss the prevalence of schizophrenia in the general population. However, you would need to say where you found this information. You couldn't just say that 2% of people had schizophrenia. You would have to show where you found that information so that people reading your essay can trust that what you're saying is true. Finally, we would embed academic literature into writing when we are discussing research. This is so that your reader can clearly see what research you are discussing and find the original research paper that outlines that research. This way we can be totally clear and transparent in our discussion of research by directing our reader towards the original source so that they can compare, if they choose to, our discussion of the literature to their own interpretation of that study. I will now show you a worked example of a piece of academic writing, and together we can identify where in that piece of academic writing we would need to embed the literature. This short paragraph discusses pre-drinking in the student population. Student pre-gaming or pre-drinking parties are notoriously dangerous, providing a social context for individuals to engage in heavy alcohol consumption before attending another event, with the primary motivator of saving money. These events account for approximately 45% of all student drinking episodes, with around 75% of student drinkers regularly attending, and encourage extended drinking throughout the daytime before an evening event. Although a widespread phenomenon, researchers aim to identify individuals who may be more likely to engage with these activities. Research found that those who regularly engage in heavy episodic drinking and who intended to drink heavily were more likely to attend pre-gaming events. Now, there are several areas in this paragraph where we would expect there to be in-text citations pointing the reader to academic literature supporting these claims. Here is that same paragraph again with the in-text citations and a colour-coded key to show you why those citations are there. For example, this citation here supports the definition of pre-drinking with a discussion of what pre-drinking is. The next two citations, here and here, are supporting generalised statements. The first discussing the primary motivator for students attending pre-drinking events, and the next supporting the statistics that the author presents regarding student drinking. Finally, we have a citation here drawing the attention of the reader to the research that's being discussed in this sentence. So, thank you very much for watching this video discussing embedding academic literature into writing. I hope that it's been informative for those of you who are unsure as to how you would embed literature into scientific writing. And I look forward to seeing you when you attend the university next year.